Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the NHACC Lunch and Learn program, Identifying and Protecting Natural Resources During Subdivision Developments. My name is Barbara Richter, and I'm the Executive Director at the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions. And for those of you who don't know NHACC, we are a nonprofit organization working to support conservation commissions so that they can be successful in protecting their local natural resources. And today's program is going to focus in on identifying and protecting those natural resources during the development process. So we're going to look at ways to protect significant natural resources when designing conservation or open space subdivisions, and look at the site-specific ecological inventories for data-driven planning. So this program builds on our previous Lunch and Learn, balancing conservation and housing development that we presented 2 weeks ago with resilience planning. So if you didn't have a chance to view this program, it's now on our YouTube channel, and we'll make sure to include a link to this program in our follow-up email. And so then just a reminder that this program is being recorded, and we will send out the recording link to everybody who registered tomorrow, either later today or tomorrow. So, and you're welcome to share this video with anyone else on your commission or a planning board or anyone that you think would be interested in learning more about conservation subdivisions. And so today's guest speaker is Jeff Littleton. Jeff is, oops, the, oh, looks like we have Dr. Theis's screen there. So I'm gonna turn off Dr. Theis. So we'll share screens in a little bit. Yeah, so just be careful. The chat box is at the bottom, but that green share button is for our presenters. And so we have Jeff Littleton here today. And Jeff is the principal ecologist with Moosewood Ecological. He has more than 30 years of experience in ecological studies and environmental education. He specializes in conservation planning, land management and stewardship, habitat restoration and enhancement, and native plantings to promote biodiversity and resilience on multiple scales. Moosewood offers ecological services for a wide range of entities, including private landowners, federal and state agencies, and municipalities, as well as land trusts and other nonprofit organizations. Jeff serves as adjunct faculty at Antioch University. In addition, he's a member of the Cheshire County Cooperative Extension Advisory Board. And before we begin, just a few quick items. As I mentioned, we will be sending out the recording of this program tomorrow. And again, feel free to share this with anyone you think would be interested. We're asking all participants to remain muted so that we can hear our speaker today. We have quite a few people on the call, so make sure you hit that mute button at the bottom. And we do invite you to ask questions today. The best way to do that is in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. As we get through the program at the end, we should have some time where you could raise your hand either with the raise your hand button or unmute and raise your hand the old-fashioned way. So again, now I'd like to welcome Jeff to our program so he can talk a little bit more about that site-specific planning. Thank you, Jeff.
All right, thank you, Barbara. Thank you for having me here today. It's quite the pleasure, and thank you all for joining here for NHAC's Lunch and Learn. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here. And as Barbara said, I'm Jeff Littleton, principal ecologist with Moosewood Ecological. And we're a team of ecologists and wildlife biologists. Just to give you a little background on what we're all about, again, we're really specialize in conservation planning and land stewardship. So we do conservation planning on multiple scales from a lot of municipalities, but even larger landscapes, and then land stewardship on parcel-based assessments as well. So welcome to Identifying and Protecting Natural Resources, Informing Open Space Subdivisions. So just a quick recap, also what Barbara says. So this is a follow-up on open space subdivision planning presented by Resilience Planning a couple of weeks ago. So I'm really looking at today about identifying and protecting those resources centered around doing open space subdivisions. Um, and so I won't be getting into the design of open space or regulations or zoning ordinances. But what I would like to do for the next 30 minutes is provide you with a discussion, a little backdrop on about town policies and regulations that can be used for overall natural resources protection. Like to touch on a little bit on town-wide conservation planning, multiple aspects of that, using natural resources data when planning these subdivisions, and how do we identify the most significant areas to protect, and then follow up with a little bit on land stewardship on, well, what do you do afterwards? I hope that also to generate a good discussion through this Zoom platform about all the information that we're talking about. I noticed that there's a lot of people that have open space conservation subdivisions or conservation subdivisions on their books in your communities. So you may have some specific questions. So I'm certainly going to leave time for that discussion. So getting right into it, just to provide again a little backdrop about natural resources protection, I'd like to talk a little bit about your policies and regulations because they really help to define the character of your community um, through land use planning, which is quite critical for each of our communities, as you well know. Um, One of the biggest pieces in developing policies in your community are your master plans, which are typically updated every 10 years. This really helps to set that community vision, those policies moving forward about how do you see your community into the future. Again, updating them every 10 years to keep things fresh with new data, new ideas. How is the community moving? How is it acting on its existing master plan? Um, and one of the things that when crafting your master plans, I've reviewed quite a few of these, and especially in terms of natural resources protection, it's really important to be very specific about your goals in protection and identification of significant, important natural resources in your community, and particularly these in your natural resource chapter and your land use chapter. And there's a variety of other chapters that you may have that also relate to natural resources protection. There's certain elements that are required of a master plan, but then some communities go above and beyond that as well. So there could be some other linking chapters to your natural resources protection. But again, being very specific about your goals, your recommendations, your thoughts moving forward. And your master plan is that policy that really helps to support your land use regulations. So these policies and regulations should talk to one another, essentially. Another piece, a very important piece, are your zoning ordinances, which really defines how land can be used in specific geographic areas. So, you know, within your communities, there's some standard zoning districts that we have, residential, commercial, maybe a business district, your rural districts, agricultural districts. Some communities have defined even other types of districts. Those are some of your basics. Um, but, but your zoning ordinances really provide those regulations for those zoning districts. Excuse me, had to move something out of the way. And other land use activities really help minimize those impacts to your natural environment, to your community character, to help move forward with your community vision from your master plan. So a lot of zoning ordinances also include protections for natural resources. For instance, there's there's a lot of communities in New Hampshire that have wetlands protection districts. Sometimes these are called overlay districts, where certain resources like wetlands, steep slopes are protected, certain waterways that are protected as well that aren't set at the state level. Some communities have groundwater or aquifer protection districts or overlay districts, protections for floodplains. And these particular overlay districts apply an extra set of sort of rules and regulations of natural resources protection in combination with the regulations for each of the districts. So it overlays over the whole town. So it's not necessarily specific to a particular zoning district. And these are just in general. Um, Next, what we're really here to kind of hone in on a little bit more is subdivision regulations, which really guides the subdivision of land for your residential lots. You know, it includes some of the basics of minimum lot sizes, road and boundary setbacks, and the protection of significant natural resources. And being very clear in defining these is very important as well. Also in minimizing the impacts on community and environment in general, but really trying to hone in on the protection of those significant natural resources that your community values. And it's really important that your subdivision regulations really align with your master plan, your zoning ordinances, as well as site plan review regulations. Speaking of site plan review regulations, not necessarily related to residential uses, more for other types of developments and multifamily dwellings, but it does address the goal of natural resources protection, or it should in some form or another. While we're talking more about subdivision regulations, site plan review certainly comes in a variety of ways, looking at open space or conservation subdivisions as well, particularly for private ways that enter into these areas. Now, these four documents together, and sometimes communities also have earth removal regulations as well. So all of these different types of regulations in your master plan come together, and to better understand how well these documents align and exactly what types of natural resources are protected and where they're protected, communities can engage in a natural resources review or an audit to better understand how all these documents align. That's another form of natural resources protection that then folds into your land use planning, particularly around subdivision regulations. Now, let me back up just for a moment to talk a little bit about open space subdivision for those that may not be as familiar with this. It is a type of a form of residential subdivision where typically an applicant generally can increase its density, housing density. There's flexibility that's built in with lot size, frontage, maybe setbacks as well. But provided that certain provisions are being maintained, such as permanent protection of common open space or open land, protection of view sheds and watersheds, and significant natural resources are protected along the way, as well as making sure that the development meets the planning board's criteria for subdivision approval. And something really important to align that with is that it meets the goals of your master plan and your natural resources inventory. Being very explicit about this is important when designing an open space ordinance. Now I'd like to move into talking about natural resources protection and planning a little bit. Most communities in New Hampshire have some form of natural resource inventory, or as I'll call it from here on out, as an NRI, which many of you may know. You know, this includes a variety of maps, data that's involved, and a report that helps to explain what these resources are, why are they important for protection moving forward. Typically, recommendations are going to come out of this, So your NRI itself can be a standalone document, but also a chapter within your master plan, which is very important, again, to be specific about your goals and objectives for natural resources protection and recommendations moving forward. NRIs are used for informed decision making, that land use planning, and education in general, not only of the general public, but also of town board members as well. And again, it looks at better understanding your types and distribution of your natural resources. While it captures a good picture of what's happening, there's a lot of information that's fine scale on the ground that sometimes is not captured. And that's where we highly recommend conducting field or biodiversity assessments to help verify a variety of data on your landscape, such as the Wildlife Action Plan, the New Hampshire Wildlife Action Plan's habitats, which they are explicit in suggesting that communities should uh, uh, check these information and check them out in the field. Also, what these site assessments does is to better understand biodiversity in general, so you can have a catalog of this in your community to track changes over time, but also to look at species of greatest conservation need, and particularly rare species that are listed on a state or federal level, or potentially some exemplary or rare natural communities. Next in line, and that is basically the springboard for a conservation plan. Typically, communities start out with a NRI and then move into a conservation plan. Others combine these together at the same time. And your conservation plan is really your blueprint for your town's future conservation efforts. Where are the most significant areas in your community? How might these be protected and set up to help out with land use planning, as well as working with willing landowners for conservation in general, but can help support your zoning ordinances, including open space subdivision ordinances. Typically, one or both of these, your NRI and or your conservation plan, should ultimately identify your conservation focus areas, which really demonstrates those resources of high value and where they sort of co-occur together on your landscape, trying to tease out some of the most important areas in your community. And we typically do this through a variety of co-occurrence analyses. It's either on a town-wide level, but also a parcel-based level, because this demonstrates particular parcels in their significance for, say, water resources or wildlife resources. Where does it fall in line with the other parcels, properties in town? And typically what comes out of this is a map similar to this. This is in Claremont, an NRI that we recently finished. And through these analyses, we've identified a variety of different conservation focus areas. And this is inclusive of all the data that's really used in the whole process. And more specifically, how might your conservation focus areas align with developing or refining your open space or conservation subdivision ordinance? Should this play into that element? It should be in your master plan as well. Your NRI and your conservation plan should be a part of that. And that's what does help to influence your conservation open space subdivision. So moving into using your natural resources data, sort of the main part of this conversation here is your first step is consulting your NRI and conservation plan, using your maps. There's a variety of information that you probably have on hand. Maybe your NRI needs to be updated. Maybe you recently updated that. There's always new data that's coming out. But using your maps is a first approach at trying to understand a particular parcel and what natural resources are known from sort of a coarse to a medium kind of scale, with using existing data or maybe some data that was created during your NRI. So to go through a couple of themes here, quickly, many of your natural resource inventories will include this information, is understanding where your surface waters and wetlands in your community, particularly on a property that is being proposed for an open space subdivision. One of the criteria is better understanding these resources, and maybe your community has that wetlands overlay district that already has some form of protection on that particular property. So trying to understand where these resources are on that property, your NRI helps out. Particularly in this one, again, your wetland and surface water resources. Um, your groundwater resources may be of great importance to your community, and if a subdivision is being proposed on a particular property, how does your aquifer systems and particularly future water well or water resources may be affected? Wildlife resources is always a big question. How are the wildlife resources going to be affected on a particular property? Using the Wildlife Action Plan, we can understand some of these larger scale habitats, but it doesn't get to those fine scale habitats, such as vernal pools that are out on the landscape. But it's a great starting point to better understand what resources are on a property in question. Also, some good information to have is your wildlife corridors. This is information that was developed by Fish and Game as well of the property that's being proposed for development. How might these modeled wildlife corridors be affected through the design of your open space development plan? Another big interest in communities these days are agricultural resources and the protection of future farmlands, should they be needed at some point through the lens of agricultural soils. Some communities have a high priority for protecting existing farmlands, and where do those existing farmlands overlay some most significant soils in your community? So this map demonstrates agricultural soils and active ag lands. Are some of these prime farmland soils on a property in question? Does your community value those particular soil resources? And how might that plan protect these resources down the line while still affording the opportunity for the housing development to pull through? Steep slopes is always an issue. Steep slopes generally preclude certain types of development, but not necessarily all types of development. But another piece of your natural resource inventory that may be of significance. Now, the maps that we just went through, none of these had parcel boundaries on there. So if you have these static maps and you're trying to do some planning to look at a potential project moving forward, it might be difficult. You can certainly figure it out using your maps, but having your parcel lines on your maps is also helpful. This is an example from Newport, where in their NRI we produce the maps without the parcel lines because they can really obscure the data underneath. But we also provided another set with the parcels on there specifically for the Conservation Commission as well as other boards to be able to review potential projects, to look at all these different resources that we mapped on the community where you can specifically see what's on a property prior to a site visit to see feasibility and potential designs. And again, going back to your conservation focus areas, identifying these parcels within each one, because obviously when it comes down to land development, it comes down to the parcel lines, the boundaries themselves, and how might that particular development be designed in a more environmentally friendly way to protect those resources that are significant for your community moving forward. So using static maps has its pros and its cons, um, but at least it's a great start. And one thing that I'd like to share with you now is a data mapper Um, let's see. Give me just a second here. I hope everybody can see this well. This is here we go. This is a data mapper that we developed for the town of Jaffrey. It's similar to the one that's on Granite View. Many of you probably use the one that's on Granite View. Sometimes it can be a little clunky, a little hard to work with. This one we designed specifically for the town of Jaffrey as we're updating their natural resource inventory. This mapper isn't quite complete yet, but it shows all the data that we used in the natural resource inventory, and will also include data that we developed specifically for that project, such as active agricultural lands. We mapped a variety of different wildlife resources, grasslands, vernal pools. A variety of data is going into this, and this is specific for the community in which they can easily use this for the planning board to look at proposed projects, the Conservation Commission, but this is also a public guide as well. So this has a variety of different data that's associated with it. And I'm just going to go through a variety of pieces here. Then we'll hone in on a particular property to see how this data can help inform from a planning standpoint, from a sheer mapping of medium and core scale data, moving forward to look at feasibility and potential design to move forward into doing more site-specific investigations, which we're going to touch on. So the data that, here, let me back up a little bit. The data that you see right now includes streams and ponds. The green parcels are conservation lands. You can probably see up on the top left-hand side here, these conservation lands, what type they are. As well as the other data that's in the legend that's being shown. So every time we click onto one of these map layers that's in the bottom left-hand side, it'll populate the legend, and it's very fast. So it's quick for planning. You can use this during your planning board meetings, your conservation commission meetings, select board. You can look at this at home as well. So we can add a variety of data here. Now we've added the national wetlands inventory data on top of here. You can also add groundwater data where you see in the bottom right corner, the large sort of darkish blue polygon is the aquifers in Jaffrey. And then those yellow and red areas include sites that are called the favorable gravel well analysis, which could identify potential community water supplies. Where might these resources be on a property that is being proposed for a subdivision, particularly maybe an open space conservation subdivision to allow for proper planning? So there's a variety of other data that we have in here. And if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, we can then add wildlife corridors to this information, the habitats. This will eventually include also these conservation focus areas, as well as farmland soils, active uh, agriculture in the community, flood hazard areas. So areas that may be already in your zoning ordinances that have certain protections. You can see where these elements are on a particular property to understand what your existing limitations are based on your regulations, and then moving forward with your more site-specific assessment. So let's just zoom in on a property here for a moment. And this is, I'm just picking this one basically random. There's nothing that's being planned on this property, not that I'm aware of. I'm not even sure who the owner is. None of this has owner information at all. So we can take a look at this particular large property with a pond in the middle and the brook that's heading north to Mount Monadnock, or actually it's heading south away from Mount Monadnock, excuse me. Again, the areas that are in purple are the National Wetlands Inventory. So this is data that was developed, and this is sort of more that coarse scale data where fine scale on-site investigations would probably identify more wetlands on the property. Again, it's a place to start for your proper planning for an open space development. To this, the groundwater tab is on, but there's no groundwater resources there. So that is not a concern for that particular property. But if your community is extremely interested in finding that wildlife corridors and wildlife resources are important, we can toggle this switch on. Now we can look at some of these primary habitat blocks that are in green, combine that with primary wildlife corridors in orange that looks at how a variety of, I think it's roughly 23 species was put into this modeling, and to see how they might be moving about the landscape. So if corridor and connectivity is extremely important to your community, listed in your master plan explicitly for protection, that might be one of the considerations in the design of your open space development. You can also add to this the wildlife action plan habitats. Maybe your community has identified specific habitats of high priority for protection. Again, you can compare these or look at these habitats in the legend here. What habitats are specifically on this property? In the light orange there, we have grasslands, and then in the darker orange are your northern hardwood conifer forest, which aren't that common here in the Monadnock region, but as you move further north, they're much more common. As you move to the southeast part of the state, they're not common at all and essentially non-existent till you get up into higher elevations. If farmland soils is of significance for you, and particularly the community has identified prime farmland soils as a high priority for protection, the areas in red delineate these particular areas. So now you're starting to see where wetlands apply, where your prime farmland soils apply. How does all this really figure into your site planning and siting of um, the subdivision itself? So just a quick view of this data mapper. This is very useful as you can toggle the information on and off. Again, you can use Granite View as a resource as well. Some of the data that we have on here may not be on Granite View, but the data that is on Granite View is tied into this and is updated on a regular basis for those data sets that are updated. Again, there's some specific data that will be added to this, more fine-scale data to help further identify significant natural resources. I'm going to step away from this and go back to the presentation. All right, I hope everybody can see the presentation again.
Jeff, before you go too far or go back
Yes.
to your presentation, what was that map something you created for Jaffrey? There's
Oh,
a
yeah, so
question of, yeah,
that that
how do people get a map like that?
Yeah, so that is actually a digital GIS data mapper. So that's accessible through online. Jaffrey has set it up for the public to view this. We did create this specifically for Jaffrey. There's other communities that we're helping out with. So it makes it really easy to visualize any of these resources that you put into this data mapper. Again, it's basically the same thing as like the Granite View data mapper. For those that are familiar with that, you can look up on Granite for this data mapper. But it's a little bit faster because it's only dealing with the town of Jaffrey, and we're able to add specific data that we collected through field investigations or through other types of analyses, through viewing aerials, doing LiDAR imaging analyses as well for data that we created, such as potential vernal pools. But then we verified vernal pools out in the field as well, and rare species and rare and exemplary natural communities. So this is more of a online application that can be used at any point by anyone.
Wow, that's excellent. And I did include the link to the Granite Mapper in
Oh,
the chat, just so people can get to that for, for some of the basic information that you covered.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, that'll give people a little reference to that. And I would suggest checking out the Granite View and see how well it works for you. Again, the data that's on there is a little bit limited, but still helpful in your planning process. Unless your town has access to GIS and a planner that can pull up all of this information. But again, the more site-specific information is what you want when designing that open space development. And so that's our next piece here, as looking at moving from the more of a coarse scale down to a more fine scale on-site assessments on a particular property. And that's the better to understand those site characteristics that are there that you can't pick up from other data, that you can only acquire through site investigations. Um, so that's why during your NRI, if your community is able um, to support field investigations, these field assessments or biodiversity assessments, that helps to better understand rarity elements, species of greatest conservation concern, or other questions that your community may have about the priorities for significant natural resources and protection through on-the-ground surveys. On a town-wide aspect, that provides the opportunity to learn where these elements are, but more specifically, what habitats and landform associations are they associated with? And if the property in question where a development is being proposed, then that may beg the question about, well, could that species potentially be on this property, providing that on-site investigation to protect rare species. Um, there's been a couple of examples in the communities. I know just firsthand from where we've worked and identifying a variety of rare elements on the landscape and where they're associated with. And then the Conservation Commission has come back to ask us, hey, there's this proposed development. One particular area was a solar array that was being proposed. And in this particular site, through our investigations and the associations of the rare plants that we found in the community, above and beyond what natural heritage, the New Hampshire Natural Heritage Bureau had on their database, we were able to provide them with a list of potential species that they should be on the lookout for to, again, this wasn't a subdivision development, but it was based on land use change within a floodplain looking at a solar array, potential solar array system. So that provided guidance moving forward for the Conservation Commission to make recommendations to, for some due diligence work on the end of the developer to say, hey, are these species out there? If they are, where are they, and how might that plan be adjusted to protect those species? Again, conducting these site field assessments, identifies your vernal pools. Obviously, during a subdivision, wetlands need to be mapped, vernal pools need to be mapped, but there's a variety of elements that aren't being considered. Again, looking at exemplary natural communities that could be on a property, maybe some old growth that's on a property that could be part of that open space development plan and that protection. For perpetuity. So I'd like to conclude here and open the discussion up more for questions. I'm sure you probably have some, but I think we need to go beyond just the planning aspect of understanding on a coarse scale and a fine scale of what is on a particular property in order to define it or plan it and site it in such a way that it's more environmentally friendly, that it helps protect those significant natural resources. But then, so identifying those areas that are going to be protected in perpetuity into the future, but how are those going to be protected long term? I think that's one piece that's missing, and I think so what happens next? Should communities start to think about, the idea of, through these open space developments and ordinances, should some sort of stewardship fund be set aside to look at monitoring or to develop a stewardship plan for that particular open space, if you will, that's part of the open space development, to ensure that there's long-term protection of that natural resource, not just now when it's being set aside now, but what about 50 years, 100 years down the line? Are those elements still being protected in perpetuity, which is the idea behind an open space development plan? So I guess quickly here, take home messages. We all need places to live. You know, there is a housing shortage that's happening right now. Housing prices are skyrocketing, but we all do need places to live. But informed planning can really help to protect some critical natural resources should communities adopt these open space or conservation subdivision plans. And using your NRI and your conservation plan as the initial phase for these assessments, to follow them up by your site-specific investigations and kind of going above and beyond and looking at some of the rare elements that it's known in your community. Might they be associated with that particular property in question? And again, ensure that your master plan includes very clear, specific language that drives your land use regulations, and identify your goals and objectives for natural resource protection for those significant elements. And again, think about that long-term land stewardship moving forward. So I hope I've given you a little something to think about this afternoon and maybe for the months and years to come. There's a lot more that we could talk about out there, but I'm happy to, I think we have about 15 minutes or so.
Right.
Happy to entertain some questions, Barbara.
Great. Well, thanks. I have one right off the bat that I'm really, I loved looking at that specific parcel in Jaffrey. And one of the things I noticed is that depending on what resource you're looking at, whether it's soils or wildlife, you know, somewhere on that property, there's going to be something special. And
Yes.
so, you know, how do you, as a conservation commissioner, say, well, this is where we should put the development for a conservation subdivision when we know that, you know, and I think for so many of us, all of that is special. So it's really hard. You could talk about co-occurrence, or you talked a little bit like directing back to the master plan. But as a commissioner, how do you go through that process to really say, here's a place that the development could go?
Exactly. So that property did point out quite a few special elements, and a lot of properties do. Um, and that is a difficult decision to make, and because it is about a compromise. Conservation is a compromise between development and preservation. And so the idea is to protect the best of the best in the community and on a property specific level. But one of the things that I always fall back on is what is the community's priorities for protection into the future? Falling back again on your master plan, those goals, objectives in there for that protection. In your NRI, those goals and objectives, the recommendations that should be aligned with your master plan as well. And aligning these elements, these documents together is really important. So that comes down to a community decision and essentially we're basing value. We're comparing value of one resource to another and what's most important in your community. Maybe your community doesn't have a whole lot of prime farmland soil, and maybe that's not a big priority of the community. So maybe that doesn't weigh into the factor as much as, say, weighting factors. Again, that value based element are rare plants more important to search out and understand where they are to protect into the future, which are protected on a state and federal level. So it's a value-based element, I
Right.
think.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, getting out on the ground is also a good way to kind of maybe some of that comes to the forefront if you actually see, you can kind of maybe see the quality of that, of, you know, like this really could be a working farm. Whereas if you're on the ground and you're like, well, there's no access or there's no, this isn't really ever going to be a farm. So while there is prime ag soils, it's not the best, place for a farm. So, all right,
Absolutely.
let's go
Go
to
ahead.
the chat and we'll start some questions. Um, is open space as you mean it, if the boundary can be altered by the owner in the future? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. I'm guessing that if once that open space area has been established, that's typically a, a permanent designated area.
Yeah, that should be permanent and those boundaries, um, well, I'm not a lawyer,
Right.
but but typically that shouldn't be adjusted. It could be added to with more conservation land on the adjacent parcel. That would be one way of enhancing that. But yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly what that question is trying to get at.
Right. And I guess, this was a case in Milford where that 5 acre open space can be moved in the future. And it's a challenge because I think depending on what the town or city is trying to protect, they may find the need to be able to adjust that. But I would say that's not typical.
Hmm.
All right, so what are the top priorities as conservation commissioner right now? What are your top priorities? Um, I mean, you can try to answer that, Jeff, but I think like each town has their own.
Yeah, and that's what we try to tease out when we work with each community is and it what is significant to you right now by having community forums, getting the public involved, in the process is important. But that is right now. These can change over time as more development comes into the area that may not be associated necessarily solely with residential development, but other types of development. And how is the landscape changing? What elements are like missing, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, we don't have much of this here anymore. We need to prioritize this particular natural resource. So
So, how can a rare plant in the Natural Heritage Bureau occurrence um, be protected when the location should be kept private? That's a challenge.
yes, that is true. Site investigations would illuminate where that is on the property, and then that can come into the scheme. It's up to the landowner to um, release that data to natural heritage. The landowner owns the plant, where the landowner doesn't own the wildlife. Wildlife is property of the state. The plants are the property of the landowner itself. So when we find rare elements on a landscape, we don't share that information at all unless the landowner specifically provides us with the permission to do so. But it still
Um,
can be written into a stewardship plan.
So are there models or blueprints out there for conservation plans? Um, in some, yeah. Do you want to address a model or blueprint for a conservation plan?
Um, well, I guess that's kind of a hard question in general. A blueprint, when I was mentioning a blueprint, it's just sort of that idea of this is how we're going to be moving forward with planning conservation in a community itself. So the format, the natural, excuse me, UNH Cooperative Extension has a nice guide on how to develop a conservation plan and maybe those elements that are associated with it. So that could be a blueprint in of itself, the different elements of describing your natural resources, what areas you want to protect, what's most important to your community moving forward. So if you to look up UNH Cooperative Extension Conservation Planning, I'm sure you'll find that guide. It's a short guide and it really does just cover the topics that should be in a conservation plan. And that's typically on a either a municipal level for municipalities, but also land trust engage in conservation planning as well for their regions that they serve.
Right. It can be it's hard to have that blueprint. And the same thing with like a model ordinances. I know a lot of towns look for model ordinances for conservation subdivision. I think it can be helpful to look at other towns to see what they're doing, but it's always important to address what's important to your community and not necessarily just copy, you know, a blueprint from another town because obviously your natural resources are going to be different. What your community focuses on is going to be different as well. So that's what I thought was really interesting about the tool that was created for Jaffrey. It really gave you the opportunity to look kind of back and forth between those different resources and how to prioritize based on, what's out there. All right, let's see. Let me see if I can find a few more questions down here. Let's see. As part of the subdivision or site plan regulations, the town can require the natural Heritage Bureau data check as part of the review process, and that can be added to the town regulations. Do you have
Yeah.
an example or story of a time when you worked across boards in your community to make a project happen?
Across communities on a particular property, no, I don't have an example of
No,
that.
across boards. I think they mean like planning
Oh,
board
oh,
to commission and select board, maybe.
um, no, one of the things we haven't really been involved with are doing these site investigations for open space subdivision plans. Particularly our site assessments are really geared towards conservation planning on a municipal level or on a property level, more from a stewardship planning aspect. So we haven't been asked to identify these areas for open space plan development. We certainly can do that because of our skill sets. But no, we haven't been engaged in that type of work yet. I would like to make a mention back to Sandy's comment about natural heritage data check. That is an important tool that a community can use, but please do be aware because I've been in meetings that seemed like that was the end all be all, that nothing showed up in the Natural Heritage Bureau data check, and therefore there's nothing on that property. That's not true. What that means is Natural Heritage has nothing in their database on that property or within, they usually do within 1 mile of that property. They'll say explicitly, there's these elements on the property and within 1 mile they're there. But if there's no hit that comes up, it doesn't mean there's no rare elements on a property. But I've been in meetings where people subscribe to that. Well, there's nothing on there, so we're all good to go. So the conservation community, you should be very aware of this.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. I want to add one more thing though about working across town boards to work on a project. I know that some communities have actually site review committees, which incorporate one member of a conservation commission, one member of a planning board, one member of a, zoning boards. And so you can create a specific site review um, committee that addresses specific, it's not every type of development, but certain larger developments, if it's a certain impact to your community. And that site selection or site review committee is set up for the purpose of making sure that all of those boards are working together. All right, let's see if there's a um, looks like I've hopefully I've gotten through most of the chat questions. So if anybody wants to just unmute and ask a question, we've got another minute or two, so you're welcome to do that. I know it can often be hard to put a question in the chat if it's a more complicated scenario. So feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask a question directly to Jeff, and we'll see how that goes from here. There's definitely a lot of good resources in the chat box, so we'll try to capture that for the follow-up email and make sure we get you some more examples and resources and links that we've put in here. So for now, let me just double check. I don't see anybody with a raised hand either. It's tough when there's a large crowd to see the raised hand. So
Oh,
definitely unmute if you want to.
Barbara,
Yes.
I think
Sandy.
I just wanted to mention, I believe that the Office of is it Planning and Development? I'm not sure what they're called these days. The planning group at the state level does annual surveys of municipalities on various topics. They do it on a wetlands ordinance. I think they also have a topic on like a cluster subdivision. I'm not sure what they call it. But that might be another place where there's a resource on what towns have. But I always encourage folks to not only look at their website and their ordinance and see what's there, but talk to somebody and see how it's working or see whether there's some other thing that's been a problem to them that's not yet been fixed.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And I'll look and see if I can find that Office of Planning and Development. I know that they have those lists of different ordinances that towns have. So I'll try to pull their conservation subdivision or open space subdivision list, see if we can find that. And there were a couple questions on ownership and whether or not these maps include ownership. And typically, I think the answer is, and Jeff, you can respond to this, but the parcel information is coming from your town maps. And so that does include ownership and who's owning the land. So, I think for this broader scale review, knowing who the landowner is, it shouldn't be a problem. So those would be listed in these maps. Is that correct, Jeff? That the map that you created for Jaffrey does include parcel ownership, and is that based on your town tax maps?
So the tax maps that everybody has access to on Granite really just includes the parcel number. Then it would be up for you to take that parcel number, look at the town's website, which a lot of them have like Access GIS that you can then learn who the owner is. So yes, that information is public, but the data that we use, we don't see that ownership. We only see the parcel number that's associated with it. So that could be populated into a data mapper, just like that is on a lot of sites that have a digital format for checking out property records, since it is
Okay.
public. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Good to know that there's an option there as well, because I know a lot of people don't enjoy having their name easily recognized on some town maps. So,
Right. Right.
and then one of the other comments was that the homeowners association is typically in charge of the open space, and this has been a problem in the past. And trying to put in more layers like monitoring by a third party and
Mhm.
not a conservation commissioner town is another option. We only briefly touched upon stewardship, and that is kind of a whole nother topic. And I put in the chat as well that NHACC and UNH Extension are presenting a stewardship for conservation easement monitoring, and that starts this evening. So join us if you want to talk a little bit more about stewardship, but there's definitely a lot to consider and to think about and for future planning for the stewardship of these lands, because it's true, they're a little more complicated because they don't often have a land trust or third party monitoring and enforcing that. So having as much in your regulations to allow for that protection and talking about the purposes of that protected area is really important. And, we're continuing to try to come up with better language to make sure that those areas are protected in the future.
I think that is a big challenge moving forward. Yeah.
And somebody asked if there's a link for the evening program. I think you can still sign up. I did put the link in the chat that gets you to the sign up page for this evening's program. And I believe that's going to be recorded as well. So we are at 1 o'clock, and I want to thank you all for joining us. It's been a great program, a lot of good questions. Again, I will send out that recording tomorrow. I'll try to follow up as well on a lot of the questions that we had on what's happening in the legislature, and capture as many of these resources as we can to share. But if we missed your question somehow, or you have additional questions about where to go for information, please feel free to email me at barbara@nhacc.org. So everybody, have a great afternoon. I appreciate you joining us. And Jeff, thank you so much for your time. And it's always great to see all the wonderful work that you're up to. And I'm really excited about that Jaffrey map. It looks really like an amazing resource for a community. All right.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
Have a great afternoon, everybody.